I am Abigail Martin, 33 years old, and for years I thought the greatest battle of my life was paying off student loans and building a career that no one believed I could. I worked 80 hours a week, climbed until my hands shook, and finally bought a penthouse in Seattle that I called my victory. But I never imagined that victory would become the weapon my own family would use against me. At my sister's wedding, while the music played and guests raised their glasses, whispers started spreading that I was giving away my home as a gift. By the time my father stepped up to the microphone, the eyes of nearly 200 guests had turned on me, waiting to see if it was true. What happened next shattered every illusion I had about family, and it left me facing a choice that would change not just my future but the balance of power in our entire family. Stay with me, because the truth of what unfolded that night is something you will want to hear to the very end. To understand how it all began, you have to know where I came from. Living in Seattle, working as a financial consultant with a view of the skyline that reminded me every day how far I had come, I carried the weight of a success built on loneliness. That loneliness had its roots back in Portland, in a childhood where I was always the one expected to fend for myself. My parents, Richard and Linda, never tried to hide who their favorite was. My younger sister, Emily, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. She had new dresses every school year, signed up for summer camps that cost more than I made in a month, and her room was filled with trophies and ribbons even before she turned 10. I was the one who learned to make do with hand-me-downs, the one who saved my allowance to buy my own school supplies, the one who spent weekends babysitting the neighbors' kids to earn pocket money while Emily was out at dance practice or being dropped off at the mall with her friends. I remember coming home one afternoon when I was about 14. Emily had just returned from a week-long camp in the mountains. She was showing off a new fleece jacket with her name stitched on the sleeve. My mother beamed, adjusting Emily's hair like she was preparing her for a photo shoot. I stood in the doorway, sweaty and tired from mowing lawns all day, clutching 20 crumpled dollars I had earned. My mom barely glanced at me. My dad asked if I had finished my chores, and when I nodded, he turned back to Emily, laughing at her stories. That was how it always went. There were moments when I thought maybe, just maybe, if I excelled enough, they would notice me. Debate was my thing. I loved the rush of standing at the podium, laying out arguments, countering every point. I practiced until my throat was raw, memorizing entire pages of material in the dim light of my bedroom because my parents never bothered to come to a single practice. The night of the state championship is burned into my memory. I was 16, dressed in the only blazer I owned, its sleeves a little too short because it had belonged to my cousin before me. My coach clapped me on the back, whispering that I had a real shot. When they announced my name as the winner, I felt something inside me swell so big I thought it would lift me right off the stage. I turned to look for my parents in the crowd, hoping this would be the moment they finally saw me. But the seats were empty. Afterward, I walked out into the cool night air and pulled out my phone, dialing home. My mother answered, her voice rushed and full of background noise. She told me they couldn't make it because Emily had a big performance at her school. I could hear the applause and laughter echoing through the line, and my father's voice in the background cheering. I hung up before she could say anything else. I remember sitting on the curb outside the auditorium, trophy resting against my knees, the metal cold and heavy. Kids streamed past me with their parents, everyone chattering, hugging, posing for photos. My coach asked if I wanted to celebrate with the team, but I told her I was tired. The truth was, I couldn't bear the idea of smiling through the emptiness. That night when I walked into our house, Emily was twirling in the living room in her sparkly costume, cheeks flushed with pride. My parents clapped as if she were on Broadway. My father said she had the entire crowd on their feet. I set the trophy on the hallway table, hoping they would notice. My mother glanced at it, then turned back to Emily and asked her to do the routine again. It was in moments like that when I made silent promises to myself. If no one else would take care of me, I would. If no one else would cheer for me, I would learn to live without it. I hardened pieces of myself layer by layer, building an armor that would carry me into adulthood. Still, even as I pretended it didn't matter, I knew the truth. Every laugh, every smile, every dollar spent on Emily instead of me, carved out a place inside me that I would spend years trying to fill. And though I didn't know it then, the imbalance of love and loyalty in our family would come crashing down decades later in ways none of us could have imagined. For now, I just kept moving forward, clutching that silent vow in my chest, determined never to need anyone who refused to see me. College became my escape route, even if it meant signing my name on loan papers that felt like a lifetime sentence. In 2010, I packed my bags and moved into a cramped dorm room at the University of Oregon, determined to carve out a future no one could take from me. While Emily was being showered with new furniture for her off-campus apartment, 2 years later, I was piecing together hand-me-down bedding and eating ramen 4 nights a week. By the time I graduated in 2014, I carried a degree in finance and $52,000 in student loans. I can still remember walking across the graduation stage, the green cap and gown heavy on my shoulders, my heart full of hope and dread at once. My parents showed up that day, but only because Emily had driven them. They clapped politely when my name was called, but afterward my dad leaned in and told me not to stress about finding a job right away. He said maybe I should come home for a while until I figured things out. I smiled, but inside I was burning. Going back to that house was the last thing I was going to do. So I applied to every opening I could find and eventually landed a junior analyst role at Northwest Capital Advisors in Seattle. The offer was hardly glamorous, the pay barely covered my rent in a shared apartment with 2 strangers, and the hours were brutal. I often stayed until midnight working through spreadsheets until my eyes blurred. More than once, senior associates walked past my desk and dropped sarcastic comments about the new girl trying too hard. I swallowed every slight, every dismissive smirk, and kept grinding. There was one night when I left the office at 2 in the morning. The streets of downtown Seattle were nearly empty, the streetlights throwing long shadows across the pavement. My heels clicked against the concrete as I walked toward the bus stop, clutching a folder of reports I needed to finish by morning. My phone buzzed with a text from my mom, a photo of Emily at some gala with Daniel, the man who would eventually become her husband. She wore a sparkling gown and a smile that seemed effortless. The caption read, "So proud of our girl." I stood there staring at the screen, my fingers numb, until the bus pulled up with a hiss. Not once did they ever send me a message telling me they were proud of me for holding down 80-hour weeks. But little by little things shifted. By 2018, I was promoted to associate. By 2020, I had climbed to senior consultant. My loan balance shrank as my bonuses grew. I still worked insane hours, but the exhaustion was tempered by a sense that I was finally building something of my own. Then came 2021. I will never forget the feeling of standing on the balcony of the penthouse I had just closed on. $2.1 million. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating purchase of my life. The unit overlooked Puget Sound, glass walls opening to a sweeping view of the water dotted with ferries gliding across under the late summer sun. I ran my hands along the marble counters in the kitchen, stepped across the polished hardwood floors, and pressed my forehead against the cool glass as if I had to touch it to believe it was mine. That night, I opened a bottle of champagne I had saved for years and toasted myself. I thought of every lawn I mowed as a teenager. Every night I sat alone in the library while my parents cheered for Emily, every sarcastic remark at the office. Every penny I had paid off toward those crushing loans. I had done it without anyone's applause. When my parents visited a few months later, the reactions were predictable. My father walked through the entryway, glanced around, and asked how much it had cost. When I told him, he whistled low and said it was a lot for someone single. My mother shook her head, running a hand over the leather sofa I had chosen with such care, and said a woman didn't need that much space all to herself. She suggested I should think about renting it out until I found a husband. I smiled tightly and offered them coffee. Inside, I wanted to scream. The walls around me felt like armor, proof that I had carved out a life far beyond their approval. But even in that moment of triumph, their words left an echo. A part of me still craved recognition that would never come. As they sat in my living room, Emily sent a text to my mom that lit up her phone. She turned the screen toward my dad, both of them smiling as if the world revolved around her. I excused myself to the balcony, the cool wind off the water brushing against my skin, the skyline glowing in the distance. The view was breathtaking, but I knew it was only the beginning. What I did not realize was that the very place I had bought to symbolize freedom would soon become the center of a storm my family would unleash. Emily had a way of floating through life as if the ground beneath her would never give way. While I clawed my way through debt and sleepless nights, she seemed to bounce from one job to another without consequence. At 25, she tried marketing for a boutique in Portland, then quit 3 months later because her boss was too demanding. At 27, she announced she wanted to work in event planning but left before the year was out. By the time she turned 30, she had cycled through 5 different roles, none lasting longer than a year. Yet, whenever she landed back at our parents' house, she was greeted with sympathy and fresh casseroles as though she were a weary traveler who deserved rest instead of accountability. I would sometimes scroll through social media late at night after work, my phone glowing against the darkness of my bedroom, and see photos of her lounging at the beach in California or flying to New York for a weekend concert. All of it supported by credit cards and quiet transfers from my parents' account. Not once did I see her panic over an overdue bill or the shame of stretching a paycheck to cover groceries. Then she met Daniel Rivera. Daniel was 32, a high school history teacher in Tacoma. The first time I met him at a family dinner, I noticed his soft-spoken manner and the way he pulled out Emily's chair before sitting down himself. He wasn't flashy, didn't seem like the type to chase after status symbols. He asked me about my work with genuine interest, and when I explained the basics of advising clients on investments, he nodded thoughtfully instead of glazing over the way most people did. Still, their relationship moved quickly. Within 9 months, Emily was flashing a diamond ring across her Instagram feed. I remember the moment vividly because my mom called me at the office that morning, her voice breathless. She said Emily was engaged, and wasn't it wonderful, and Daniel was such a good man. I congratulated her, but when I hung up, I stared at my screensaver for a long time, feeling the familiar ache of being reminded once again that Emily's every milestone was a family holiday while mine barely registered. My parents promised to cover the entire wedding. Venue, flowers, catering, dress. Every detail would be handled by them. When I overheard my dad telling Emily not to worry about the budget, that she should just focus on being a bride, my chest tightened. I couldn't help but flash back to my own graduation when I had begged them not for money but just for their presence, only to be met with excuses and half-hearted claps. One evening, not long after their engagement, we gathered at a small Italian restaurant in downtown Seattle. I had agreed to meet them after work, even though my body was exhausted from a week of back-to-back client meetings. Emily arrived in a pastel dress, Daniel at her side looking as calm as ever, and my parents glowing as though they were the ones getting married. We ordered wine and appetizers, laughter filling the table. At one point, Emily leaned over to Daniel and whispered something that made him chuckle softly. My mom watched them with misty eyes before turning to me. She said how wonderful it was that Emily had finally found her person. Then, almost casually, she added that Emily and Daniel would need plenty of space once they were married. I felt the comment hanging in the air, heavy with implication. My dad chimed in with a smile, saying that young couples deserved to start off strong with a good home and support from family. I swallowed hard and pushed my pasta around the plate, pretending I didn't understand. But my mom didn't let it go. She set down her fork, folded her hands, and said that my place was so big, so beautiful, and what a gift it would be if Emily could have that as her first marital home. Her words were coated in sweetness, but underneath was a sharpness that cut deep. Daniel looked startled, his fork pausing midair. Emily smirked as though the idea wasn't shocking at all. My father raised his glass in a mock toast, saying how wonderful it would be for family to support family. My throat felt tight. I managed to smile weakly and say I was happy for Emily, but inside, my heart pounded with a mixture of disbelief and anger. My home, the very symbol of everything I had fought for, was being spoken of like a toy that could be passed down to the favored child. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I nodded and responded at the right times, but my mind kept circling back to those words. By the time I left the restaurant, the cool Seattle air hit my face, and I felt the sting of my mother's comment lodged like a splinter under my skin. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, and stared out at the glowing street lamps. I knew this was not the end of it. My parents had planted the seed in public, and seeds like that rarely went unwatered. The weeks leading up to Emily's wedding became a blur of fittings, flower trials, and endless phone calls. Despite my reservations, I found myself volunteering more than I should have, holding bouquets up against ivory gowns, double-checking vendor contracts, and making late-night trips across the city to pick up samples of stationery. Emily always seemed to be too tired or too distracted to handle the details herself, so I carried the weight while she soaked up the praise. At one dress fitting, my mom clasped her hands under her chin and sighed at how radiant Emily looked. Then she turned toward me, her smile tight, and said how important it was that a marriage started on the right foot. A daughter deserved a proper foundation, she added, drawing out the word in a way that made it clear she wasn't talking about shoes. My dad chuckled, smoothing the lapel of his blazer, and said Emily had earned a good start. Their eyes met briefly, a silent agreement passing between them. I stood at the edge of the room, pinning fabric near Emily's waist, my stomach twisting. The comments kept coming, light and veiled, but never random. Over dinner at my parents' house, Dad dropped remarks about how young couples today struggled with housing and how lucky Emily was to have family support. Mom nodded and added that blessings came in many forms, especially when one sister had more than enough and another was just beginning her journey. My fork clattered against the plate as I tried to keep my face neutral. Even outside my family, the pressure was relentless. At the office one morning, I was reviewing a client portfolio when a colleague named Mark leaned against my cubicle wall. He smirked, coffee in hand, and asked why I worked such long hours when I didn't even have a husband or kids to support. He said it as a joke, but the words carried that familiar sting, the assumption that a woman's worth was measured only by the people she belonged to. I forced a laugh and said I enjoyed the challenge, but inside I felt the same exhaustion I always did when society tried to shrink me into a box I refused to fit. Later that day, in a meeting room filled with men in suits, I presented a strategy I had spent weeks refining. One of the senior partners interrupted halfway through, repeating my exact words but with more authority, and the room nodded as though he had invented the idea. My cheeks burned and I clenched my pen so hard I thought it might snap. Between work and family, the message seemed clear: independence wasn't admired, it was tolerated at best and mocked at worst. In the middle of all this, my cousin Sophia reached out. She was a year younger than Emily, quieter, the kind of person who observed more than she spoke. She called me one evening and asked if I had time to meet for coffee. We sat in a small cafe near Pike Place Market, steam curling up from our mugs as the city buzzed outside. Sophia hesitated at first, fiddling with the edge of her napkin, then she leaned in and lowered her voice. She said she had overheard our Aunt Karen and my mom talking during a bridal shower prep session. They were discussing the penthouse not as a possibility but as though it was already decided. Sophia repeated their words carefully, saying they had mentioned how generous it was of me to give Emily such a gift, and how it would make the wedding unforgettable. The room seemed to tilt around me. I pressed my palm against the table, trying to steady myself. Sophia looked apologetic, saying she didn't want to upset me but thought I deserved to know what was being said. My chest tightened as I pictured my home, my sanctuary, reduced to party gossip and false promises. I thanked her, though my voice sounded distant even to myself. On the walk back to my car, the city lights blurred together and all I could hear was the echo of their words. My parents weren't just hinting anymore. They were building a narrative, one where my years of sacrifice were erased and my achievement was handed to Emily as though it had been waiting for her all along. When I got home, I stood at the window overlooking Puget Sound. The water shimmered under the fading sun, calm and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos inside me. My phone buzzed with another group text about centerpieces and seating charts, but I let it sit untouched on the counter. For the first time, I began to wonder how far they were willing to go and what it would cost me if I kept staying silent. The morning of the wedding broke bright and heavy, the kind of Seattle summer day where the air carried a warmth that clung to your skin. I drove across the bridge to Bellevue, my maid of honor dress hanging in the back seat, pressed and waiting. My reflection in the visor mirror showed layers of foundation and careful eyeliner, a smile I had painted on even though my stomach churned. The Bellevue Botanic Gardens looked like something out of a magazine. Rows of white chairs lined a lush green lawn. Roses in full bloom framed the arch, and chandeliers glistened inside the reception tent. Guests in pastel suits and silk dresses drifted around the cocktail area, balancing champagne flutes while murmuring greetings. Every detail screamed perfection, but I felt an undercurrent beneath it all, as though the beauty was just a veil stretched over something darker. Emily was radiant, I'll give her that. The lace gown fit her like it had been sewn on her skin, her veil catching sunlight as if even nature bowed to her. Daniel looked nervous but happy, fiddling with his cufflinks while his groomsmen clapped him on the back. I stood behind Emily in the bridal suite, pinning her train while my mom fussed with a stray curl. Emily glanced at me in the mirror and said she hoped I didn't spill wine on the dress like I had once done at prom. My mom laughed a little too loudly, and I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. By the time I walked down the aisle, the air smelled of roses and fresh-cut grass. I could feel nearly 200 pairs of eyes as I took my place beside Emily. The ceremony flowed easily, vows exchanged, tears dabbed away, applause ringing through the garden. For a moment, even I almost believed the illusion of family unity, the idea that we were all here celebrating without agendas. But the reception shattered that. The tent glowed golden as the sun dipped, low candles flickering on tables draped in ivory cloth. Plates clinked, glasses refilled, laughter rose above the string quartet in the corner. When it came time for speeches, I held my glass steady, prepared to say something polite, something safe. Daniel's best man went first, a string of jokes about their college days. Emily's college roommate followed, recalling late nights and dreams of fairy tale weddings. Then my father stood. He cleared his throat and tapped the microphone, the sound silencing the room. His suit jacket caught the light, his posture tall and commanding like always. He began by praising the beauty of the day, the joy of bringing two families together. Then he turned to Emily, his voice rich with pride. He spoke of her generosity, her heart, how she always thought of others before herself. Guests nodded and smiled, murmurs of agreement floating through the crowd. I sat stiffly, my palms damp against the stem of my glass. His words painted a picture of Emily I barely recognized, yet the audience drank it in as gospel. Then came the sentence that made my chest lock tight. My father's voice lifted, and he said that today was not just about love, but about family support. He told the guests how proud he was that Emily was starting her marriage with a gift that symbolized stability and care. He said our family had been blessed beyond measure, and tonight was proof of that blessing. A ripple moved through the tables, faces turning, eyes sliding in my direction. It was subtle, but I saw it, the way people's gazes lingered, curious, expectant. My stomach sank as if the ground had opened beneath my chair. I forced a sip of champagne, my throat dry, as my father's words echoed louder than the music. Emily glanced at me, then just for a second, her lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Daniel shifted beside her, looking unsure, his hand tightening around hers. My mother dabbed the corner of her eye with a napkin, as if this moment were the culmination of her own silent prayers. I sat frozen, caught between fury and disbelief. The Penthouse. They had done it, or at least laid the groundwork, planting the idea in front of everyone, cloaked as praise and pride. It wasn't a direct announcement, but it didn't need to be. The implication was clear enough. Conversations swirled after the speech. Guests leaned close to each other, whispering, their eyes flicking back to me. A couple from my parents' church stopped by my table and said how wonderful it was of me to be so giving. My lips parted, but no words came, so I just nodded, my smile brittle. The night pressed on, music rising, couples spinning on the dance floor, waiters carrying trays of cake slices. I kept moving, hugging, relatives adjusting, centerpieces, smiling for photos, all while the weight of expectation grew heavier. My pulse quickened each time another person mentioned generosity, sacrifice, or blessings. It was as though I had been cast in a play I hadn't agreed to perform in. When the DJ called for the father-daughter dance, I stood at the edge of the dance floor, my nails biting into my palms. My father twirled Emily under the chandeliers, her veil catching the light as though she were a princess. His eyes shone with pride, his hand firm on her back, while I remained an extra in the story unfolding. The applause when the dance ended was thunderous, but in my ears it was muffled, drowned beneath the roar of anger pulsing inside me. I glanced toward the exit, then back at the glowing tent, the laughter and clinking glasses. Every detail was flawless, yet I could feel the storm gathering, one I could no longer ignore. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to imagine what it would feel like to say no. To stop letting them script my life in front of strangers. And as the music shifted to a faster beat and the crowd surged forward, I realized that the wedding, for all its beauty, was not the happy ending they wanted it to be. It was only the beginning. The music thumped through the reception tent, laughter spilling across the dance floor when my mother's hand clamped around my wrist. Her nails pressed into my skin with a firmness that carried no room for refusal. She murmured something to a passing aunt about needing a word with me, then tugged me toward the hallway leading behind the catering stations. My father was already waiting there, arms crossed, eyes burning with a resolve I had seen my whole life. They guided me into a small storage room lined with extra chairs and vases of backup flowers. The door shut behind us, muffling the sound of celebration. My chest tightened. It was too quiet, the kind of silence that comes before an explosion. My father didn't waste time. He straightened his tie and said it was time we stopped dancing around the subject. His voice was low but sharp enough to slice through the dim air. He said Emily and Daniel needed stability, a real foundation, and that I had the chance to give them exactly that. I stared at him, trying to steady my breathing, but my mother filled the silence, her tone coaxing. She said I had already done so well for myself that it was almost selfish to hold on to something I didn't really need. She painted it like an act of generosity, like signing over my penthouse would prove that I was capable of being part of this family instead of standing apart from it. I felt my jaw tighten. My pulse thudded in my temples. Then my father dropped the pretense. He told me to sign over the penthouse to make it official as a wedding gift. His words came out like an order, not a request, as if he had the authority to decide what I should do with the only thing I had fought so hard to achieve. My voice finally cracked the silence. I told them no. My tone was even, but inside my heart pounded against my ribs. I said I had earned that home, every dollar, every sleepless night, every ounce of pride. It wasn't theirs to give. It wasn't anyone's but mine. My mother's face pinched with frustration. She told me Emily had always been the one to bring people together, that she was starting a family, and that I would never understand what that required. She said giving them the penthouse would prove that I cared about something bigger than myself. I laughed, short and bitter, the sound surprising, even me. I asked her where she had been when I worked double shifts in college, when I lived on ramen and coupons, when I scraped together every cent to pay off loans no one helped me with. I asked her where she was when I collapsed from exhaustion on bathroom floors because I didn't know how else to keep going. She didn't answer. She looked away as if the wallpaper held more value than my words. My father stepped closer, his presence towering, his breath sharp with wine. He said if I refused, I would regret it. That I would not only embarrass the family but shame them in front of everyone. His voice rose with each word until his finger jabbed toward my chest. He told me that if I did not sign, I was no longer his daughter. The words hit harder than I expected, but not because I believed them. They hit because a part of me had always known his love was conditional. I straightened, my spine locking into steel. I told him the penthouse was mine. I said it slowly, each word deliberate, my voice steady. I told him there was nothing to negotiate, nothing to sign, nothing to give away. For a moment, silence stretched again, heavy and suffocating. Then my father's hand twitched at his side, his jaw grinding as if he were holding back something he could barely control. My mother's eyes darted between us, panic flashing across her face, but she said nothing. I thought he might lunge forward, that he might try to rip the decision from me the way he had ripped control my entire life. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes narrowing with a rage that promised this wasn't finished. My breath trembled as I reached for the doorknob, my hands slick with sweat. I pulled it open, the sound of music and laughter rushing back into the cramped room like air after suffocation. My heels clicked against the tile as I walked away, leaving their glares behind me, but the echo of his words followed me out like a curse. The party still glittered under golden lights, guests swaying to the beat, glasses raised in cheer. To them, nothing was out of place, no cracks in the polished facade. But inside me, something had shifted irreversibly. For the first time, I had said no and meant it. And though my pulse was still racing, though fear clawed at my ribs, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. They could threaten guilt and twist the story all they wanted. The penthouse was mine. End of story. My father's hand clamped around my arm as I tried to blend back into the sea of sequins and press suits. His grip was iron, pulling me forward through the crowd until we stood at the center of the reception hall. The music dulled as people noticed the scene unfolding, chatter rippling through the tables. The spotlight that had been meant for the bride and groom now seemed to hover over us. He raised his glass, his voice booming across the room. He thanked everyone for being there, praised Emily and Daniel for their bright future, and then, with a smile that made my stomach twist, announced that the family had one more gift to celebrate. He said his eldest daughter would be giving her sister and new brother-in-law the keys to her penthouse overlooking Puget Sound. The words rolled off his tongue like they had been rehearsed, as if my consent had already been written into history. A hush swept across the crowd, followed by scattered claps of surprise. Heads turned toward me, eyes searching, waiting for my nod of agreement. My chest tightened, heat rising up my neck. I found my voice sharp but steady. I said it was not true. I told them there would be no such gift, that my home belonged to me and me alone. The air shifted immediately, the crowd erupting in gasps and whispers, tension crackling like static in the humid summer night. Daniel's face flushed, his hand tugging nervously at his tie. He looked as though the ground had slipped beneath him. Emily froze beside him, her bouquet trembling slightly in her grip, her smile cracking at the edges. My mother's eyes darted frantically across the room, pleading silently for me to just go along. But I stood still, my back straight, refusing to shrink. The murmurs grew louder. I caught snippets of voices. Did she really just say that? Is this some kind of stunt? What is happening? A few people leaned closer, phones in hand, some already recording. My father's smile dropped. His jaw clenched, veins standing out on his temples. He hissed that I was humiliating him, humiliating all of us, as if my refusal to be stripped of my dignity was the crime. He shouted that I was selfish, ungrateful, that after everything this family had done for me, I dared to spit in their faces. I didn't flinch. I looked him in the eye and repeated my answer. Number. That one word ignited him. His hand shot forward before I could move, the sound of his palm against my cheek cracking like thunder across the hall. My head snapped to the side, the sting blooming hot across my skin. For a second, the world tilted, the silence in the room deafening. Gasps broke out, chairs, scraped glasses toppled. A woman cried out. Someone shouted to call the police. My cousin Patricia rushed forward, her hands reaching to shield me, but another relative blocked her path, muttering that it was family business. The madness of it all made my stomach churn. I touched my cheek, the skin burning under my fingers, but my eyes stayed locked on his. My voice calm and cold cut through the chaos. I told him he had just lost me. The room spun with shock. I saw Daniel step forward as if to intervene, then falter, his eyes darting between loyalty and horror. Emily's lips trembled, but she said nothing, frozen by the weight of her own silence. I turned away, the echo of whispers trailing me like shadows. Guests parted as I walked toward the exit, their stares sharp and heavy, some sympathetic, others scandalized, all of them seared into the memory of that night. My heels clicked against the polished floor, each step heavier than the last, but my back stayed straight. Behind me, the music had stopped, the celebration fractured. The wedding that was meant to be a picture of unity now lay in shards on the floor, and I was the one who had refused to bleed for it. The night air hit me as I pushed through the doors, cool against the heat on my cheek. I exhaled, my chest rising and falling with a rhythm that steadied as I kept walking farther from the glow of chandeliers and the weight of eyes that had judged without knowing. I had no idea what stories would be spun inside that hall after I left. But I knew one thing. A line had been drawn in front of 180 witnesses, and it could never be erased. When I reached my building, the city was quiet, the lights of downtown Seattle flickering like restless stars. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door, the sting on my cheek refusing to fade. Margaret was waiting, her face tightening the second she saw me. She guided me to the couch without a word, fetched a cold compress, and pressed it gently against my skin. I winced but let her hold it there, the chill seeping into the raw heat of the bruise. She told me to document everything, her voice firm in a way I rarely heard. She grabbed my phone and insisted I take photos from every angle, even the ones that made me cringe to look at. She reminded me that people forget that stories get twisted, but evidence stays. I nodded, though my chest ached at the thought that I would ever need proof against my own father. The buzz of my phone started almost immediately. Dozens of messages piled in one after another, a storm of blame disguised as family concern. My mother's words were sharp, accusing me of ruining the wedding, of humiliating Emily on the most important day of her life. She claimed my refusal to be generous had forced my father into a corner, as if his violence had been my choice. Emily's silence cut deeper than anything. Not a word, not a single acknowledgement. The absence was louder than all of my mother's venom. Daniel sent a message late into the night. It was polite, almost formal, saying he was sorry things had gotten out of hand, that tensions ran high at weddings, that he hoped we could all put it behind us. I stared at the screen in disbelief. He had watched me get struck across the face, and that was all he had to say. Margaret sat beside me, her presence steady as the tide. She told me not to reply, not to feed their attempts to spin the story. Instead, she urged me to start saving everything. I scrolled through voicemails, my father's voice rumbling in fury, calling me selfish, warning me I would regret this. My mother's high-pitched tone dripping with guilt, reminding me how much they had sacrificed for me. Each one was recorded, each one dropped into a separate folder on my laptop, evidence sealed away like seeds waiting for the right season. By morning, allies began to emerge. Patricia called, her voice trembling with anger. She said what happened was not just a family squabble, but a public act of violence. She told me she had tried to step in, that others had whispered about calling the police, and that people would not forget what they saw. Allison sent a message too, saying she stood with me, that what my father did was inexcusable. Even Brenda, usually quiet at family gatherings, wrote that she had never been so disgusted in her life. Their support was a balm I had not expected, small sparks of light cutting through the heavy fog. Still, the house felt suffocating. Every ping of my phone made my stomach lurch. I silenced it for hours at a time just to breathe. Margaret poured me coffee, her hand brushing mine in reassurance, reminding me that I was not alone, even if it felt like it. By the third day, the storm shifted. My inbox pinged with an email from a law firm in downtown Portland, the subject line cold and clinical. I clicked it open, my breath catching as I read. It was from my parents' attorney. The message was short, almost sterile, but the words landed like punches. I had 30 days to transfer ownership of my penthouse to Emily and Daniel, or I would be permanently removed from their estate. The ultimatum sat on the screen, the letters blurring as my vision swam. It was not just emotional coercion now. They had turned it into a legal threat, a deadline that sought to corner me like an animal. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but there was nothing to type. No reply could capture the weight of betrayal I felt. Margaret read over my shoulder, her jaw tightening. She whispered that this was war, that I had to decide whether to keep playing defense or finally strike back. I leaned back in my chair, the bruise on my cheek now fading to a muted shadow, but the ache inside me sharper than ever. The hum of the city carried through the windows, indifferent to the battle unfolding in my life. I closed my laptop slowly, the ultimatum still glowing in my mind like a brand I could not erase. I turned my phone off completely for the first time in years. The silence felt brutal at first, like cutting off oxygen, but soon it became a kind of relief. No more guilt-drenched voicemails from my mother, no more venom disguised as fatherly warnings, no more hollow half-apologies from Daniel. For Emily, I pressed block and stared at her name for a long while before the screen went blank. It hurt, but less than letting her silence keep bleeding me out. The split in the family showed itself almost immediately. Patricia called again, her voice steady this time, saying she had told anyone who asked that what happened at the wedding was violence, plain and simple. She said she would not sugarcoat it to protect anyone's pride. In the same breath, she admitted Robert had been furious with her. He thought she was stirring the pot, that I should have swallowed the humiliation quietly to keep the family intact. He told her I was reckless for standing my ground in public. I thanked her anyway. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was willing to stand next to me instead of against me. At work, I forced myself to focus on spreadsheets and conference calls, anything that would give me structure while my personal life unraveled. Diana, my manager, noticed the shadows under my eyes. One afternoon, she pulled me aside after a client pitch and asked if I was all right. I hesitated, then told her the truth in pieces. I kept my voice, even describing how my father had struck me, how my parents were threatening me legally. She did not interrupt, only listened, her expression shifting between shock and something fiercer. When I finished, she told me I was stronger than I realized. She said the firm was about to launch a high-profile project and she wanted me to lead it. Her words landed with a weight that steadied me. For once, someone was recognizing me not as a burden, but as a force. Not everyone saw it that way. Later that week in the break room, I overheard Mark, a colleague I had known since my first year, mutter to another associate. He said I was only being handed opportunities because I was playing the victim card, that I knew how to milk sympathy. The words burned. I froze, my hand tightening around my coffee cup. For a second, the same old reflex rose in me, the urge to prove myself worthy, to fight for their approval. But as I walked out without a word, something in me shifted. I no longer wanted their validation. If they could not see the years I had given, the hours I had sacrificed, then nothing I did would change their minds. That realization carried me through the next days. The air in my penthouse felt lighter, as though each blocked number, each discarded insult had opened a window. I started running again in the early mornings, letting the rhythm of my feet pound the pavement along the waterfront, the cool breeze of Puget Sound filling my lungs. I stopped checking social media, stopped waiting for Emily to post something that might explain her silence. One night, sitting with Margaret over takeout containers spread across my kitchen counter, I told her what Mark had said at work. She slammed her chopsticks down, her eyes flashing, and said I needed to remember who I was. I had clawed my way up from nothing, carrying debt and doubt on my back while people like him coasted. She reminded me that respect given grudgingly was worth nothing. Her words settled into me like anchors. By the weekend, another family email thread leaked into my inbox through a cousin who thought I should know. It was Robert again, telling relatives that I had disrespected my father, that my stubbornness was breaking the family apart. Patricia fired back in the thread, calling it what it was, a man lashing out violently in public. The responses were split, some siding with him, others staying quiet, but Patricia's words shone bright against the murk. I closed the email with a mix of sadness and gratitude. The lines were clearer now, and I was no longer lost in the fog of who stood where. That night, I sat on my balcony watching the city lights flicker across the water. I thought about the ultimatum sitting in my inbox, about the whispers at work, about Emily's silence. For the first time, none of it made me feel smaller. Instead, it felt like the proof of everything I had always known deep down. I had been raised to believe that I needed their approval, that without it I was nothing. But here I was, still standing, still moving forward. The hum of the city below was constant, indifferent, and in its steadiness I found my own. I did not need their inheritance. I did not need their praise. I did not need to bend myself into silence just to be allowed at their table. The life I had built, the walls around me, the view of the skyline I had earned with every sleepless night and every brutal hour at work, was mine. As I turned back inside, the glass door sliding shut with a quiet click, I realized that whatever storm was still coming, I was not the frightened girl begging to be seen anymore. I had drawn my own line now, and for the first time in my life, I had no intention of stepping back over it. I was finishing a late dinner alone when my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. For a moment, I almost ignored it, but something in my gut told me to pick up. Daniel's voice came through, quiet and strained, asking if we could meet somewhere private. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We chose a small coffee shop tucked in a side street of Capitol Hill, a place where no one from our family circle was likely to stumble across us. When he walked in, he looked different, older than the last time I saw him. His tie was loose, his hair slightly mussed, and there was an exhaustion in his eyes that mirrored my own. He ordered nothing, just sat down across from me, fingers tapping nervously against the table. For a few seconds he didn't speak, and I wondered if he would back out. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice low. He said my parents had been telling him and Emily for months that I was planning to hand over the penthouse as a wedding gift. He admitted he believed them. He said Emily had believed them too. His words landed like stones in my stomach, heavy and cold. I sat back, my jaw tightening. I asked him if he ever stopped to think about why I had never once said those words myself. He dropped his gaze to the table and shook his head. He said he had wanted to believe it because it fit the version of me my parents painted, the one who owed Emily everything. I told him plainly that I was finished letting anyone, including him, dictate my life. The penthouse was mine. My independence was mine. I would not let manipulation dress itself up as family loyalty. His eyes lifted then, and for a moment there was something like shame in them. He nodded slowly, like a man realizing the foundation beneath him was weaker than he thought. Before we parted, he admitted something else. He said things with Emily had already begun to fray. He felt smothered by my mother's involvement in every detail of their lives, by my father's expectations. He said he was tired of being treated like a guest in his own marriage. I listened, but offered no comfort. His choices were his own. As I left the cafe, I felt no satisfaction in his confession, only a hollow confirmation of what I had known all along. The lies they told had poisoned not just my relationship with them, but his marriage too. Days later, the poison surfaced in public. Emily posted in our extended family group on Facebook a sprawling thread that included cousins, aunts, uncles, even old family friends. Her message was long and carefully written, but the meaning was sharp as a blade. She said she was devastated by how I had embarrassed the family at her wedding. She claimed she had expected my support, not my defiance. She wrote that I had humiliated our parents in front of everyone. The comments started pouring in almost instantly. Some relatives wrote messages of sympathy for her, calling me selfish. Others stayed silent, clearly uncomfortable. Then Patricia, fiery as ever, wrote a comment that stopped the thread in its tracks. She said Emily needed to stop rewriting the story. She reminded everyone that Richard had struck me in public and that it was not me who had embarrassed the family but him. Allison and Brenda chimed in with words of support, telling Emily to take responsibility instead of hiding behind our parents. The thread devolved quickly, voices rising in digital chaos. Robert accused Patricia of exaggerating, saying, "A single slap did not define a man." Patricia fired back that violence was violence, no matter the spin. I read every word, my hands trembling, but I stayed silent. For once, I did not feel the urge to defend myself. Their fight was not mine to manage anymore. At work, I buried myself in the project Diana had trusted me with, and each day I walked into the office, I carried myself a little taller. The more I saw the cracks spreading through Emily's carefully curated image, the more I realized I no longer wanted to hold hers together. I was done being the glue that kept a broken frame intact. One evening, Margaret found me sitting at the dining table with my laptop closed, staring at the glow of the city. She asked if I was all right. I told her about Daniel's confession, about Emily's post, about the family war breaking open online. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said, "Sometimes truth only comes out when the lies become too heavy to carry." Her words stayed with me long after she left. Later that night, I scrolled back through Emily's post one more time. Her words no longer cut the way they once would have. I saw them for what they were: a shield built from denial. A desperate attempt to cling to the narrative my parents had fed her. I closed the app and set my phone down. The storm inside my family had broken wide open, and though the noise was deafening, I felt a strange calm settling over me. I no longer feared their judgment. I no longer feared their lies. For the first time, the truth was no longer just mine to carry. It was out there, visible, undeniable, and it had begun to unravel everything they thought they controlled. Dr. Matthew's office had the kind of stillness I craved, a quiet space with soft light and the smell of chamomile tea that seemed to seep into my chest. I sat on the familiar couch, fingers curled around the edge of a pillow, and told him about the storm my family had dragged me through. He listened carefully, not interrupting, letting the pauses stretch so I could hear my own words hanging in the air. When I finally fell silent, he leaned forward, his voice steady. He reminded me that my worth had never depended on my parents' approval, and that repeating their cycle of power and shame was a choice I no longer had to make. I felt something loosen inside me, a knot I had carried since childhood beginning to unravel. Week after week, therapy became less about my parents and more about myself. I learned to sit with silence without bracing for criticism to make decisions, without rehearsing how my family might react. It felt like learning a new language, one where love wasn't conditional and loyalty wasn't currency. For the first time, I started to imagine a life that was truly mine, not one defined by the roles my family had written for me. At home, the penthouse began to feel less like a fortress and more like a canvas. I started redecorating one room at a time, pulling down the heavy curtains my realtor had chosen and replacing them with soft linen that let the morning light flood in. I painted one wall a deep navy blue, a bold choice that felt like a declaration of independence. Margaret helped me rearrange the living room. Allison brought plants. Brenda donated a set of vintage wine glasses she had found in a thrift shop. Slowly, piece by piece, the space transformed from a monument to my battles into a reflection of the people and moments I chose to keep close. When the last room was finished, I decided to host a small dinner party. Nothing extravagant, just good food, soft music, and the people who had stood by me when everything else had collapsed. The night of the gathering, I stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of pasta sauce while Margaret set the table with candles and Brenda opened a bottle of red wine. Allison arrived with a loaf of fresh bread still warm from the bakery. The air filled with laughter and the smell of garlic, and for the first time in years my home felt alive. As we ate, the conversation flowed easily, no sharp edges, no careful navigation around unspoken wounds. Brenda toasted to new beginnings, Allison teased me about finally letting go of the sterile furniture, and Margaret hugged me so tightly I could feel her heartbeat against mine. Looking around the table, I realized this was what family could feel like. Not a performance, not a hierarchy, but a choice made in love and respect. The next morning, my phone buzzed with notifications. Emily had posted on Facebook and Instagram, her words dripping with venom. She accused me of betraying the family, of throwing our parents out of my life. Her posts were long, dramatic, punctuated with old photos of us as children, carefully crafted to cast her as the abandoned sister and me as the cold villain. The comments were immediate and divided. Some relatives offered her sympathy, others hesitated, remembering what they had witnessed at the wedding. I sat on the balcony, phone in hand, the summer sun warming my skin as the tide moved gently in and out below. Margaret joined me with 2 mugs of coffee. She asked if I was going to respond. I looked at the screen, at the cascade of comments and judgments, and shook my head. I said I didn't need to fight on her stage anymore. My truth didn't need defending to strangers on the internet. She nodded, sliding the mug into my hand. That evening, when everyone returned for leftovers and a second round of laughter, I barely remembered Emily's posts at all. The music played low, the city lights glittered, and the room filled with voices I trusted. I caught myself smiling at nothing, simply soaking in the warmth around me. For years, I had believed family was something fixed and unchangeable, a blood tie I could never cut. But sitting there watching Margaret wipe sauce from her cheek while Allison joked about my clumsy dance moves, I understood something new. Family could also be chosen, built one kind gesture at a time, sustained not by obligation but by choice. And as the night wound down and my friends gathered their things, I walked them to the door, kissed cheeks, hugged tightly, and felt a fullness in my chest that had nothing to do with the food or the wine. When the door finally closed and silence returned to the apartment, I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long time, the silence felt safe. It felt like home. 6 months slipped by in a way that felt both slow and inevitable. Seattle moved from the last warmth of summer to rain and then to a winter that made the water look like slate. I kept my mornings steady with coffee on the balcony and my evenings quiet, a routine that left room for breathing. I still went to therapy, though less often now, and each session felt like another knot loosening. The blocked numbers stayed blocked. The family thread kept humming without me. The silence I once feared had become a friend. One afternoon in late winter, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I knew. Daniel had sent an image, grainy and perfect, a small profile, floating in black and white. Beneath it he wrote that he hoped one day Emily would see clearly. I stared at the picture until my eyes stung. There was no gloating in me, only a surprising tenderness for a life that had nothing to do with the scorekeeping of adults. I typed a simple reply that I wished them health and calm. Then I put the phone down and stood by the window while a ferry cut slowly across the Sound. A week later, a thick envelope arrived from a Portland law office. The letter inside was precise and cold. I had been removed from my parents' estate. No explanation beyond the legal phrasing, no attempt at warmth. I read it twice and felt nothing I would have recognized in the past. No panic, no urge to fix what I did not break. I slid the letter into the same folder where I kept photos of the bruise and saved voicemails and emails that tried to retell my life without me. Then I closed the drawer and walked to the kitchen to make tea. Work carried me forward with a steadiness I had earned. The project Diana handed me grew into a marquee win for the firm. My team pulled late nights that felt nothing like the desperation of my early years. There was laughter mixed in with the pressure, and when younger analysts asked how to handle clients who doubted them, I heard myself say things I wished someone had said to me. You do not have to bleed to prove you belong. You do not have to earn kindness with pain. Sometimes I thought about calling Emily. The impulse came like a soft tide and receded just as gently. Daniel sent occasional updates that stayed on the safe side of personal. He said they were looking for a bigger place on their own. He mentioned that boundaries with my parents were difficult but necessary. I responded with brief wishes for steadiness, nothing more. I kept my hands out of the machinery that had ground me down for so long. At home, I kept shaping my space into a place where I could exhale. The navy wall in the living room looked different in every kind of light. The plants Allison brought had taken root and began to spill over their pots. Brenda found a mid-century lamp at a yard sale that fit so perfectly beside the reading chair it felt like fate. Margaret kept showing up with soup and stories from the hospital and a kind of practical loyalty that never asked me to be less than I was. On the first clear evening of spring, I took dinner to the roof and watched the city shift from gold to blue. The skyline looked like a promise. I thought about the girl who sat on a curb after a debate win with a trophy pressed to her knees and no one to drive her home. I thought about the woman who stood in a garden full of witnesses and said no to a story that was not hers. I let the memories pass through me without catching like birds cutting across a wide sky. The truth was simple now. My parents had chosen a version of love that demanded sacrifice without end. They had written roles where one daughter existed to feed the comfort of the other. I used to think I had to make peace with that script or be cast out. Standing there in the soft wind, I understood I had never lost a family worth keeping. I had simply refused a bargain that would have cost me myself. The letter from the attorney lost its power after a few days, just another paper in a folder that would stay shut. The ultrasound photo, though, stayed with me. Sometimes I pictured a tiny hand curling around a finger, the future unburdened by the lies that weighed down the past. I hoped that child would be met with gentleness, that Daniel would keep drawing lines where they were needed, that Emily would one day choose clarity over approval. Those hopes did not change my boundaries. They simply made room in my heart where bitterness used to live. When the sun finally dropped, the city lit up one window at a time. I breathed in the cool air and let the quiet settle. I was not waiting for an apology that might never come. I was not measuring my worth against a will that could be rewritten at the stroke of a pen. My life was here in the steadiness I had built, in the work I did well, in the friends who showed up with bread still warm from the bakery and a patience that felt like shelter. I went back inside and turned off the lights, leaving the city to shine for itself. The rooms felt soft and lived in. I set my phone on the counter, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window one last time before bed. Seattle moved and breathed below me. Somewhere across town, a couple prepared a nursery. Somewhere else, my parents told a story that made sense to them. None of it demanded anything from me. Family, I realized, is not the first label you are given. It is the circle you choose and the circle that chooses you back. It is the people who celebrate your strength without requiring your silence. It is the space you guard so that the person you are can keep growing. If you have ever walked through a version of this, if you have set a boundary and been told that love requires you to erase it, I hope you will share your story in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from and what moment taught you that your worth does not rely on surrender. If my journey helped you feel less alone, tap like and subscribe so we can keep building a place where courage is ordinary and kindness is not conditional.